Hello. So C.S. Lewis has a thing about woods and trees. I've talked before about how he said that in his early teens, nature became for him the medium of the real joy. And you see this nowhere more so than in the slightly eerie, mystical joy of the dryads of the trees in Narnia. In the Silver Chair, for example, they're part of the great snow dance, wild and beautiful and joyous under the moon, their hair wafting behind them, crowned in leaves. I'll say more on the dryads later. But the joy is there more generally in the woodland scenes that Lewis conjures up in the stories. When he'd been wounded in the First World War, he came back with shrapnel in his chest and spent some time convalescing at an army depot in Wiltshire. And he'd go off exploring the long grassy walks between beech trees and oak trees, revelling in the autumn colours and the smells in Savernake Woods. Savernake Woods! Doesn't that breathe of romance? He wrote to his Belfast friend Arthur Greaves. He thought some of the trees there made it look like Arthur Rackham's woodland illustrations for Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods, which had such an important role in his teens in the rebirth of his imagination, and the feelings of yearning and longing that he associated with his particular experience of joy. His imagination was fed all his life on literary romances in woodland settings. In formative years, he discovered the Arthurian adventures of Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century epic, Le Morte d'Arthur, adventures more often than not set in the forests of England and Wales. And he particularly liked Aubrey Beardsley's woodland illustrations in the 19th century edition. And then there were William Morris stories. So, for example, one of his favourites, The Well at the World's End, gives us the journey of the character Ralph through a heavily wooded medieval landscape. And he raved to his friend Arthur about his discovery of Fantastes, the fairy romance by the Victorian writer George MacDonald, and the character Anados's journey alongside a stream into a fairy wood, and the spooky description of the terrible ash tree there. And so often it was this sort of romantic setting in the books and in nature that triggered flashes of the old poignant joy and sweet desire that he felt. So it's not surprising that in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the adventure begins for Lucy through the back of the wardrobe, which itself, of course, is made from a very special tree, as we're told later in The Magician's Nephew. But here, Lucy finds herself in the middle of a wood at night time, with dark tree shapes and the snow gently falling. And when Mr. Tumnus invites her home for tea and tells her his tales of this magical land of Narnia, they're very much tales of the forest, dances in the woodland glades, of the dryads of the trees, of hunts after the magic stag, of dwarfs in caverns beneath the ground, and summer feasting, all in a woodland setting. And it's the traditional magic wood of fairy tales, really. And the forest, we soon learn, is under an enchantment. 2/3 of the adventure is set in the forest. And the Narnia part of the story ends where it began in the woods at Lantern Waste. When Edmund enters Narnia, the wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. Eventually, 2/3 of the way through the book, the children arrive at the hill of the stone table and finally come out of the woods, and they can look down on the forest spreading as far as one could see in every direction except right ahead. Lewis enjoyed Arthurian tales in the French too, and there was one book, Le Roman de Tristan and Iseult, that he enjoyed for its romantic and atmospheric descriptions, and he highlighted this example for Arthur Greaves. Climbing to the top of the cliff, he saw a land full of valleys where forest stretched itself without end. It gave him a perfect impression of loneliness and mystery, he said. Anyway, it's right there on the hill that we first see the tree women that Tumnus had told Lucy about, and they're making music on stringed instruments in a crescent around Aslan. They'll come centre stage in the next book. A lot of Prince Caspian takes place in the woods too. When the children are whisked off from an English railway station into Narnia at the beginning, they find themselves by dense woodland above the seashore. Edmund says, "Look here, there's only one thing to be done. We must explore the wood." And the story is then neatly linked with Mallory's tradition of medieval woodland romance, and he goes on, "Hermits and knights errant and people like that always manage to live somehow if they're in a forest." And there they discover the ruined castle of Cair Paravel, which the trees have encroached on over many years. It's like the wood has taken over. When they begin to journey through the woods away from the seashore, there's a paragraph on forest paths that peter out, only for other paths to be found that then fade away too, until you have been well lured out of your right direction, which suggests mysterious forces at work, and it has the hallmarks of the woods of fairyland. But because of their experience, we're told, the group are never taken in for very long. And even at this early stage, the journey they're on begins to take on a metaphorical, spiritual overtone as they wander in the woods. They're hoping to reach Aslan's How, which is described in terms of lying within the skirts of the great woods. There's a very special moment during the journey when Lucy can't sleep and goes off walking alone in the woods under the Narnian stars. And in her odd nighttime dreamish kind of wakefulness, she senses the whole forest coming awake. A nightingale sings. Filled with longing, Lucy imagines what the graceful dryads and hamadryads of the birch and the oak and the birch would look like if they were to wake up from their deep sleep that they've gone into since the old Narnia has been forced into hiding by this evil usurper Miraz. While she decides that the silver birch would have a soft, showery voice and would look like a slender girl with hair blown about her face and fond of dancing. And softly she calls on the trees to wake, to come to her, and they do seem mysteriously to stir a little in response. The next night she meets Aslan. She's drawn to a glade of trees which make a tuneful, lilting noise as the branches move, half awakened. From a distance, the trees look as if they're walking about. And as she moves between them, she finds her feet wanting to dance. And now there was no doubt that the trees were really moving in and out through one another as if in a complicated country dance. And I suppose, thought Lucy, when trees dance, it must be a very, very country dance indeed. And Lucy dances herself as she dodges between them, and she half wonders whether she'd been using her arms to push branches aside, or to take hands in a great chain with big dancers who stooped to reach her. And there on a lawn, with dark trees dancing all around it, she meets the lion in the moonlight. And there's a moment in which the trees fully assume their dryad forms, tall, gracious wood gods and wood goddesses. And then, as Aslan passes, they bow with such graceful sweeps of branch and trunk that their bowing was itself a kind of dance. And then at the liberation of Narnia, dawn breaks, Aslan roars, and the birch girls, willow women, beeches, oak men, elms, hollies and rowans all come dancing round the lion, bowing and waving and dancing as Lewis paints a picture of glorious chaotic exuberance. They're bowing and curtsying and waving thin long arms to Aslan. Willow women pushed back their hair from their brooding faces to gaze on Aslan. The queenly beeches stood still and adored him. Shaggy oak men, lean and melancholy elms, shock-headed hollies and gay rowans all bowed and rose again, shouting, "Aslan, Aslan!" The great awakening of the trees has come. The glorious liberty of the trees is at hand. All nature seems to rejoice, and the trees of the field, they clap their hands, as the prophet Isaiah says. Then the whole mad forest of them moves off to Aslan's How to overwhelm Miraz's men, rather like Birnam Wood to Dunsinane to liberate Scotland from the tyrant Macbeth, or the Ents against corrupted Saruman in The Lord of the Rings. They've long been feared by the enemy, by the Telmarines, who've been taught to think the woods are haunted. This great expression of goodness, feared by those who don't understand it. Evil, whether it's through a Miraz, a white witch, or even in the last battle, Arishta Tarkan, tries to suppress all the sweet life of the forest. Pretty much like evil tries to suppress the glimmers of life in us too, I suppose. Woe for the holy trees, wails a beech tree near the beginning of the last battle, calling on good King Tyrion for help. Cruel Calamines are murdering the talking trees at Lantern Waste. And the Dryad's violent death is very vivid and tragic when her own tree is cut down. It's all the more shocking because the nymphs of the wood seem so much to personify joy in the stories. Twice in the last battle, the Dryads are called holy. They have something of the divine in them. Lewis's poem Song, part of his Teenage Spirits in Bondage collection, expresses his theory of dryads and other divine beings as imparting the loveliness that we experience in woods and seas and stars, which would otherwise be simply dead, delighting in the spirit and stirring the heart. It begins like this. Fairies must be in the woods, or the satyr's laughing broods, tritons in the summer sea, else how could the dead things be half so lovely as they are? You must read the whole poem, but it ends like this. Atoms dead could never thus stir the human heart of us, unless the beauty that we see, the veil of endless beauty be, filled full of spirits that have trod far hence along the heavenly sod, and seen the bright footprints of God. A later letter to Arthur Greaves casts light on his evolving ideas about the tree folk around the time of his conversion. I think the thrill of the pagan stories and of romance may be due to the fact that they are mere beginnings, the first faint whispers of the wind from beyond the world, while Christianity is the thing itself. In his famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, he says we long not just to observe and enjoy beauty, but we want to participate in it, receive it into ourselves, bathe in it. This is not paganism, he's clear about that. We're not absorbed into nature, but that is why we have peopled air and earth and water with gods and goddesses and nymphs and elves, that though we cannot, yet these projections can enjoy in themselves that beauty, grace and power of which nature is the image. The holy trees are a representation of God's own beauty, grace and power, and it's with that we will sometime be united. In The Great Divorce, Lewis puts part of heaven itself in a woodland setting, with forest glades and rivers and waterfalls within it, and scenes which wouldn't be out of place in fairyland. So, for example, all down one long aisle of the forest, the undersides of the leafy branches had begun to tremble with dancing light. And on earth I know nothing so likely to produce this appearance as the reflected lights cast upward by moving water. Well, it's not actually what he thinks it is. That'll have to stay for another day. The story ends, I've quoted it before, probably will again, with 10,000 tongues of men and woodland angels, and the wood itself sang. It comes, they sang. Sleep is awake, it comes. And the sun rises, and the eternal morning has begun.